21 CFR Part 11. It's a small regulation as far as federal regulations are concerned, but it has a far-reaching impact. We'll be covering Subpart B, electronic records, and Subpart C, electronic signatures. Subpart A, which is the general provisions, which includes the scope, implementation, and definitions, can be summarized as the following. Everything we'll be discussing here is part of electronic records and electronic signatures, applies to any record as part of any agency regulation. And when we say agency, we're referring to the Food and Drug Administration. So, with that said, let's lay it out. Okay, starting with Subpart B, electronic records, jumping into section 11.10, closed systems. Now, closed systems means an environment in which system access is controlled, and it's controlled by those who are responsible for the content of electronic records that are on the system. So a closed system must have a validation. We have to ensure that the system is accurate and reliable and performs as intended. That means, of course, that you should always start off by writing an intended use statement for a computer system, as often a computer system does much more than what you intend to use it for, and your validation efforts should really be scoped to just what you intend to use that system for. So, moving on, the system must be able to create both human-readable and electronic formats. This needs to be for inspection if the agency comes in, review by people who may not have access to your closed system. So ultimately, you must be able to print off something out of your system so that someone can read it. You have to have protection of your records, just as you would with any other doc control system, that you're controlling and protecting these records throughout their retention period. Of course, you have to limit system access to those who are authorized to use your system. There must be secure and computer-generated timestamp audit trails. This is to ensure that you can tell the story of whatever happens in your controlled system. The system must have operational system checks to enforce permitted sequencing of steps and events. This is your workflow control. If A has to happen before B, before C, the system must ensure that it happens that way. You have to have authority checks to ensure only authorized users have access to your system. You must ensure device checks. This is your code reviews. This is your terminal logins to make sure the database is operating appropriately. This is whatever it is that generally is not used as the front end. You must have something in place to demonstrate that the system is operating in the background as intended. You have to ensure that anyone who's interacting with the system, developing, maintaining it, using electronic records, have appropriate education, training, and experience, just as you would with any standard process. And as with any standard process, you must have written policies or procedures that hold individuals accountable for what they're doing when they interact with the system. Lastly, you have to have appropriate controls over systems documentation. This is your standard doc control for the distribution of the software code, of the audit trails. Those all have to be locked down, just as you would any standard operating procedure or any other quality record. Now, moving on to section 1130. These are controls for open systems. Now, an open system means it's an environment in which system access is not controlled by those who are responsible for the records that are being stored there. This refers generally to view-only situations where people are reviewing records which are part of a controlled system. So the controls for open systems basically states that all the controls we define for closed systems, if they apply, you should apply them to the open system. That's it. Okay, moving on to 1150, signature manifestations. All signatures need to state the name of the signer, the date and time when the signature was executed, and the meaning, such as what's being signed. Is this a review? Is it a approval? Is it an authorship? Whatever that is, it must be defined there. Now, it's important to state that these three things, the name, the date and time, and the meaning, these are all a record. These are quality record, and they must be maintained as such. Moving on to 1170, signature and record linking. Now, an electronic signature, just as a handwritten signature would be, must be linked to an electronic record, okay? Linked to that one electronic record. So I can't take that e-signature and apply it to a different record and then another one. There's one signature for one record. That's it. That concludes subpart B. So let's move on to subpart C, electronic signatures. Okay, section 11-100, general requirements. So, for electronic signature, it shall be unique to one individual. Okay, it can't be reused by multiple people. Additionally, before an organization gives someone that electronic signature, they have to verify the identity of that individual. Additionally, before an organization uses any kind of e-signature, e-record system, they must certify in paper to the FDA that these e-records, these e-signatures, are legally binding equivalents of traditional handwritten signatures. So let's get down into the core of e-signatures, section 11-200. Signatures must employ at least two distinct components. This is an identification code and a password. This is traditionally your username and password. Now, if in your system they type in their username and password and then sign 5 things in a row, for each of those 5 things, the only thing that's additionally required each time they sign is the password. Now, if they're signing something in a non-continuous way, such as they sign something once and then stop and then sign something else, both the username and the password, both the identity code and the password, are required for each signature. Also, the system must be set up so that if someone's attempting to use someone else's signature, it requires at least 2 people collaborating. So ultimately, if someone's trying to hack your system, they can't do it alone. So all these things apply to non-biometric signings. This is when you type in something. For a biometric, this is your fingerprint, this is an eye scan, anything that's associated with an individual's biologics. All you must require is that they cannot be used by anyone other than the genuine owners. It must be actually unique to that one person. All right, last section, 11-300. These are controls for identification codes and passwords. So you must maintain uniqueness of identification codes and passwords. 2 people can't have the same identification code and password. It wouldn't make any sense. To that end, periodically, we must either check or recall those usernames and passwords. We must have procedures in place for loss management. So if someone does lose or writes down and someone takes someone else's username and password, what do you do in those situations? And lastly, we must do periodic testing of the device, of the system, of any kind of tokens, any kind of cards used. Basically, there must be preventative maintenance of the system to ensure that these electronic signatures remain accurate. So, with the regulation out of the way, let's talk about Part 11, do's and don'ts. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to divide those people who interact with the system into those who indirectly interact and those who directly interact. An indirect interaction would be establishing the system, validating it, maintaining it, anybody who works behind the scenes to ensure that the system is operating. A direct interaction will be those who actually log in and use the system. This could be people in an office setting using computer software. This could also be people on the manufacturing floor interacting with equipment, lab software, and anything involved with production. First and foremost, let's talk about validation. Specifically, we must maintain a state of validation of the system. That is, we must do what we said we would do in the validation. To that end, we must create documents, work instructions, procedures, and then create training around those to ensure that we train those who are directly interacting with the system on what exactly must happen. Following that through to the direct side, people who are directly interacting with the system must read these documents, they must understand them, and they must follow them. And of course, as with anything in quality, if you see something, say something. If you're a direct interactor and something is not what is proceduralized, speak up. Also, those directly interacting with systems often have ideas for improvement. The important thing is to communicate these ideas of improvement, but do not act upon them until those ideas are validated and then you've been trained to them. Now, let's talk about security. On the indirect side, we must establish procedures and education for both loss prevention and loss mitigation. That is, we define what is acceptable and not acceptable behavior for authentication and what to do if anything goes wrong and authentication is compromised. The big things on the direct side is that you do not communicate your password. This password is the same as your signature. You shouldn't verbalize it to anybody. You certainly shouldn't write it down on a piece of paper or a post-it note and put it on a workstation. And if you have to leave for any given amount of time, you should log out of the system to ensure that your credentials remain safe. Now that we've talked about validation and authentication, let's talk about auditing. It's important to perform regular audits on the system to ensure its proper operation. These audits should include system checks of the software system itself, as well as a process review to ensure those who are interacting with the software are doing so as intended. These audits should certainly include those who are directly interacting with the software. As I said before, if you are interacting with the software and you see something, say something. To summarize, we need good documentation surrounding the system. We have to provide training on that documentation to ensure it's followed by those who are interacting with the system. Those who are interacting with the system must treat their digital signature as if it was a paper signature. All of this should be audited at regular intervals to ensure that the system is operating as intended.